She sat in the front row of my father's funeral, dressed in black, dabbing at eyes that hadn't cried for him in over a decade. Everyone thought she was the grieving widow. But there was one thing she didn't know yet. I had already made sure that, on paper and print, in front of everyone who had ever read it, she never existed. If you've ever watched someone get away with cruelty for years, smiling through it, wearing the mask of family, while destroying someone you love from the inside out, you're going to feel every second of the story. Hit that like button, subscribe, and stay with me, because this is the story of a daughter who took back the one thing her mother couldn't manipulate, threaten, or steal: the truth. My name is Sarah, and for most of my adult life, I lived with a secret so heavy it nearly broke me before I ever found the words to say it out loud. My mother was not a good person. She wasn't just difficult, or cold, or occasionally selfish the way people warn you mothers can sometimes be. She was something else entirely, the kind of person who could smile at a dinner table while quietly bleeding the people around her dry, and make you feel crazy for even noticing the blood. My father, Robert, was the opposite. Steady, quiet, the kind of man who fixed things instead of talking about his feelings, who worked 60-hour weeks so he could pay off the house we grew up in, brick by brick, year by year, sacrifice by sacrifice. He wasn't perfect. He didn't say, "I love you" often, and he communicated more through fixing a leaky faucet or driving 2 hours to help a neighbor move furniture than he ever did with words. But he was good, bone deep, unglamorous, reliable good. And he loved my mother, Denise, in the particular, aching way that decent people love someone who does not deserve it. The way you keep watering a plant you already suspect is dead, because giving up on it would mean admitting something you're not ready to admit. I didn't understand the shape of what was happening in my house until I was old enough to look back and see the pattern instead of the individual moments. When you're inside something like that, you don't see a monster. You see 1,000 small cuts, spread out over so many years that no single one of them ever seems worth mentioning out loud. You tell yourself, that wasn't so bad. That was just how she is. That's not really abuse, is it? And you keep telling yourself that, year after year, until one day you look up and realize the cuts added up to something you can't unsee anymore. It started small, the way these things always do. Comments about how Dad wasn't good enough, said just loud enough for me to hear from the next room, like she wanted me to absorb it too. Whispered phone calls to men she'd met online. Phone tucked against her shoulder while she stirred dinner like nothing was wrong, like my father wasn't sitting 20 feet away in his recliner. She told anyone who would listen, friends, neighbors, eventually even me, her own daughter, that she and my father were basically separated, that she was only staying for the money, that once the house was paid off, once the timing was right, she'd finally leave and marry someone who actually deserved her. She said this for years. Not once. In a moment of anger she'd later regret and apologize for. Over and over, like a script she'd memorized and rehearsed, delivered with the same flat confidence every time, while my father kept working, kept coming home, kept trying, kept pretending. For my sake, I think now that he hadn't heard. I used to lie awake as a teenager wondering what it would take for him to leave. I used to wonder what was wrong with me that I couldn't make him see it. I didn't understand yet that he did see it. He just already decided, somewhere deep down, that leaving would mean admitting 30 years had been a mistake, and some part of him would rather absorb the damage than say that sentence out loud. Then his body started failing him, and everything got so much worse. It was slow at first, the kind of slow that lets you pretend it isn't happening. A cane he just needed for a while, then a walker he was embarrassed to be seen with. Doctor's appointments that turned into specialists, then into procedures, then into a diagnosis that would define the next 15 years of his life, chipping away piece by piece at the strong, capable man who used to carry 2 bags of mulch on each shoulder without breaking a sweat. And as his body became a cage he couldn't escape, my mother didn't step up. She stepped in, but only far enough to control him. She managed his money. She managed his medications. She managed who he saw, when he saw them, and what he was allowed to say when they visited. And underneath all of it, quietly, expertly, she managed a story everyone else got to hear. He always said no. That house was his. He'd broken his back to pay for it, decade after decade, mortgage payment after mortgage payment, and he wasn't going to hand her the satisfaction of watching him walk away from it, even if staying meant staying with her. Pride is a strange, stubborn thing in a man like that. It kept him in a house that had slowly become a cage of its own. Eventually, his body made the decision he never would. He became too sick to manage anything on his own, and for the first time in 15 years he let me step in. He made me his durable power of attorney. He added me to his accounts. Not out of some sudden distrust of the world, but because he finally, quietly understood something he'd spent a decade and a half refusing to say out loud. The one person who was supposed to protect him never would. It wasn't a dramatic conversation. He just handed me the paperwork one afternoon and said, "Take care of it." And we both understood exactly what he meant. And then, the day after Thanksgiving, I brought him home. My home. On hospice. I remember carrying his bag up my front steps and feeling something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Not peace, exactly, but relief. Sharp and unfamiliar, like finally setting down something heavy I didn't realize I'd been carrying. For the first time since I was a child, my father was somewhere safe. Somewhere no one was going to raise their voice at him, ignore him for hours, or make him feel like a burden for simply needing help. I spent those final weeks doing everything I could to make sure his last days on this earth were good ones. Warm meals, made just the way he liked them. Familiar shows playing quietly in the background, the same ones we used to watch together when I was a kid. His favorite blanket pulled up to his chin every night. I held his hand more in those few weeks than I think I had in the 10 years before them combined, and I don't regret a single hour of it. He passed away on December 1st, 2022, in a room that was quiet and warm and entirely, finally his. And in the raw, aching days that followed, the days where you're supposed to be allowed to simply grieve, to just be a daughter who lost her father, my mother found one more way to remind me exactly who she was. The funeral home informed me that, despite everything, despite the power of attorney, despite 15 years of her absence from any real caregiving, despite the fact that I was the one who'd fed him, bathed him, and sat with him as he died, they still legally needed her consent to cremate him. I sat with that information the way you sit with a bruise you didn't expect to be pressed on. After everything, she still held one more piece of leverage over my father, even in death, even now, when there was nothing left to gain except one final act of control. Predictably, she said no. She only agreed once I allowed her to keep his Social Security survivor benefits, money that, legally, would have gone to her automatically anyway, whether I agreed or not. She didn't know that. She thought she was negotiating for something she had to be granted, and I let her believe she'd won because I needed my father's body treated with the dignity he deserved far more than I needed to correct her. But something inside me had gone very, very still and very, very clear. I was not going to let her write herself into the ending of a story. Not after everything she'd taken from him while he was alive. Not this. Not the last word. When it came time to write his obituary, I sat down with a blank page and a cup of coffee that went cold before I typed a single sentence, and I made a choice that I knew, even as I made it, would detonate something. I wrote about my father's life, his work ethic, the house he built with his own hands and his own money, nail by nail, weekend by weekend. His dry sense of humor, the quiet, undemonstrative way he loved the people around him, showing up instead of saying things. I did not write a single word about a wife. No mention of a marriage. No mention of a widow. No, survived by his loving spouse of 30 years. Nothing. As far as that obituary was concerned, Denise did not exist in Robert's story, because for the 15 years that mattered most, the years when he needed someone the most, she hadn't shown up for it. You don't get written into the ending of a story you spent decades quietly sabotaging. I hit submit, and I felt my hand shaking, not from fear, but from something closer to relief. It didn't take long for the fallout to start. Within a day, the calls came. Aunts, cousins, old family friends who'd known my parents for 30 years and had absolutely no idea what had actually gone on behind closed doors because she'd spent decades making sure they never would. "Sarah, is everything okay? Where's your mom in the obituary? Was there some kind of mistake?" There was no mistake. Then came the call I'd been quietly waiting for. Her voice on the phone hit a pitch I'd never heard from her before, somewhere between fury and genuine disbelief, like she could not process the idea that the world might not automatically hand her the role she'd spent 30 years rehearsing. "How could you do this to me? People are asking questions. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is for me?" And for the first time in my life, I didn't soften it. I didn't manage her feelings the way I'd been trained to since I was a little girl watching her cry on cue. I didn't protect the image she'd spent 3 decades meticulously constructing. I told her the truth. When people asked what happened, and they did, again and again in hushed, careful voices, I didn't dodge it. I told them about the affair she'd carried on for years while telling everyone she was basically separated. I told them about the money that disappeared out of his accounts while he sat sick and alone. I told them about the nights he waited for water, for his blanket, for someone to just be present, while she was somewhere else entirely, living a different life on the side. I told them about every legal door we'd knocked on that had been slammed shut with the exact same tired phrase, "Civil matter, nothing we can do," until it started to feel like a curse rather than a policy. I watched, conversation by conversation, as the image she'd spent decades building, devoted wife, tragic caretaker, grieving widow, came apart in real time. Not because I destroyed it with some grand, cruel speech, simply because I stopped protecting it. That's all it ever took. The truth had been sitting there the whole time, waiting for someone to finally say it out loud without flinching. Here's the part one thing surprised her most. I wasn't cruel about it. I didn't need to invent anything, exaggerate anything, or perform outrage for effect. I just told people what had actually happened, calmly, plainly, the way you describe any other fact of your life. And that was so much worse for her than anger would have been. Because for the first time in 30 years, there was no controlling the narrative. No twisting the story back into her favor with a well-timed tear or a practiced sigh. No dabbing at dry eyes in front of an audience that still believed the performance. The obituary had already told everyone the one thing she never wanted them to know, that in the story of Robert's life, she simply wasn't part of the ending. And once that door was open, the truth walked right through it, calm and unbothered, and never left. She lost the image. She lost the sympathy. She lost the entire audience she'd spent 30 years carefully cultivating, and she lost it in the one place she couldn't manipulate, threaten, or spin her way out of, the plain, quiet truth, spoken by the daughter who had finally stopped protecting her. I've spent years in therapy since then, unpacking what it means to grow up with a parent like her, the kind of slow, insidious harm that doesn't leave visible marks but reshapes the whole architecture of who you become. And here's what I've come to believe, sitting with all of it. My silence was never actually protecting her. It was protecting the story she got to tell about herself, at the expense of the truth, at the expense of my father, at the expense of me. I didn't ruin her image. She built it, brick by brick, lie by lie over 30 years. I just stopped being the reason it stayed standing. If this story hit you somewhere deep, if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and finally telling the truth, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever had to reclaim your own story from someone who tried to control it? And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe, because there are so many more still to come.